Good morning, everybody. I just want to let you know we will start our presentation in just a couple of minutes. We'll wait for a few more people to jump on. So we'll start at about 3 or so after the hour. So grab your coffee and we'll be with you in just a minute. Thanks. All right. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for attending our webinar on securing companies in an IoT world. I'm Tom Ruffalo. I'm the CISA at eSecurity Solutions. Chris Knight will be presenting for Forescout. They have a great solution for IoT and network access control. And we thought this would be a great topic to cover today, given the direction of security threats in the world and the proliferation of IoT devices. So let me just start with a quick introduction of the topic. In an evolving timeline of threats, as we've seen in this chart here, we've seen evolution from the 90s, where things were a lot more simple and mostly malware and worms and hacking, which has always been there, email and phishing. And in the recent years, we've seen ransomware, software supply chain attacks. And I think in the world we live in now, we're going to see a continuation of all of that, but we're also seeing a lot of threats evolving because of the cloud and the internet, and IoT is one of them. So IoT threats increased by 600% just in 2017 alone. We've seen some high-profile attacks where IoT devices are used for denial of service attacks, and basically once IoT devices have been compromised, they can be used for almost any attack, and if they're on your internal network, it causes additional problems. We're also seeing the devices will be growing to as many as 3 billion devices by 2020. Obviously, some of those are installed in the home, but a lot of them are moving in and out of companies. And 83% of consumer routers, as analyzed by, I believe, as Consumer Reports, have shown vulnerabilities. So a lot of the products do have vulnerabilities and are subject to threats and attacks. So what are the obstacles to IoT and security? Well, first of all, there's thousands of manufacturers, and so trying to get thousands of manufacturers to provide secure products is like herding cats. And that's one of the reasons for that is because there are really no standards, right? There's no standard operating systems, there's no standard platforms, and even if those standards evolved, the way they're implemented is still subject to each individual vendor's solutions that are even the applications that ride on top of that. As I said, the platforms aren't standardized today, though, and it probably will be a long time before they are. And there's no security testing required. There's no standards for that either, although there are testing facilities that do exist. So one of the problems is that IoTs are frequently insecurely installed. So that's something that you can control as a company. The existence of devices on networks is frequently unknown. So that's one of the issues that has to be solved. You have to know, you have to get the visibility of what's going on in your network. The devices move in and out in real time, right? People, watches are IoT devices. People hand carry things in. Technically, your laptops, your mobile devices, and anything that connects to the internet is an IoT. And if it's not monitored and visible on your network, then it's uncontrolled. And they are being used to launch cyber attacks. So we know this is possible. We know there's an issue. We know it's going to get worse. So what are the top defenses against IoT attacks? Well, one of them is pick your partners, right? So for the devices that you know are in your network, you need to make sure those vendors are qualified, that you know something about what they're doing to make sure the devices are secure. You do control at least that piece of it. A second component would be the deployment and configurations. If they're devices that you know about and you're controlling, then you can also have some control of that. You can use best practices. You can isolate the IoTs on networks that are not other than your core network, unless, of course, it's something that has to interact with your network. Access control is a big factor, right? And access control and authentication and privilege control, all of that is necessary for every device in your system, and certainly for anything that's coming in that's an IoT device, the same thing has to be true as well. So using multi-factor authentication, and most of the good devices, the ones that do care about security, do have these kinds of capabilities built into them. Making sure that automatically or supervised, and I would guess and supervised system updates are conducted on them, so that as they find vulnerabilities, we need to make sure that they're patched and updated. Advanced malware protection, if possible, on those devices themselves, but if not, then, and this is where IoTs are really unique, is that you need to have solutions at the gateway and on the network that provide you with the visibility of what's on the network, which is where NACs can help you solve those problems, and automatic monitoring, and you need to know, when there's a compromised IoT, you really need to monitor the network. You need to monitor the devices themselves if possible, but you have to look for the sort of tangential effects of these devices, because you don't necessarily have an agent running on them like you do with a normal endpoint. And then you need to be able to quarantine these devices if they're unauthorized or if you believe they're compromised. So this is where a strong solution like what Forescout offers is going to be super helpful. Another point is, for solutions for an IoT-enabled world, companies must have risk assessments. This is best practices stuff, right? Risk assessments, define your strategy, define your plan, and prioritize what you need to get done. Implement preventive, detective, and also remediation type solutions, and then make sure somebody is helping you monitor, manage, and adjust these solutions, right? So this is all part of a totally integrated, well thought out security solution. And of course, eSecurity Solutions is all about doing that. That's our business. We're Newport Beach-based, Southern California-based company. We have customers all over the country, and we provide them with risk assessments, and with advisory services. We provide managed security. We're evolving our solutions into managed detection and response, and we provide the customers with security training, and we can help you on individual projects. And we work with the leaders in the industry in terms of solutions and products in each area of security, such as Forescout. And with that as an introduction, I am going to transition this presentation over to Chris Knight. So let me do that. And Chris, it is over to you now.
Okay. And can everyone see my screen here? Hopefully we're good.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm Chris Knight. I'm Director for Systems Engineering. That's pre-sales engineering in the West, so West Coast, and certainly Southern California. To kind of go a bit into what we do, certainly we call visibility out to the devices that are on customers' networks in their environment, and that runs across campus, traditional. It also extends into things like the data center, cloud, and then unique environments, operational technology. But certainly I'll focus on the campus side of it. So where you'd expect to see kind of these traditional devices, right? Windows, Mac, smartphones, Android, iOS-based devices, Linux, of course, and extending that to IoT. And I think the story here is, over the past 25 years, we got to this kind of 10 billion devices, which are your traditional, what we'll refer to as traditional devices, all the ones that you see here in our little circle. So these are PCs, mobile devices. There's good strategies around how to manage those, get visibility to them, make sure things like antivirus is going to be installed, running and up to date on Windows and Mac, things along those lines, or an Android or iOS based device that it is provisioned correctly on and given to a user in a BYOD case, or something that the company actually provisions. So everyone's got a pretty good handle on those, at least in terms of the management strategy. And what we're seeing is in the next 5 years, we're going to get to 3x those number of devices, but it's going to be this whole new type of environment where what we saw with BYOD is going to be IoT. So all of these different devices that are going to come in with the challenge of, hey, they don't run a standard operating system, or at least something uniform, where in the past you could have an agent-based solution to make sure that signatures and different security posture could be provisioned to the device to make sure that it's not, going to fall prey to some kind of vulnerability or some kind of attack that's out in the wild. So really, the challenge here is, twofold. One, these devices can't be managed in the strategy that's been used in the past, and the other is that the proliferation and just mass of these devices, the scale of which is really going to take off in the next 5 years in terms of what we're going to see here. And IoT goes a bit deeper. IoT could be anything from personal or home devices to, things you might find in an office, which traditionally we'd look at like a printer or maybe a VoIP phone, but that's extending into things that help users and help, employees get their work done, automate things within the office. Further from that would be things like a medical device. So all of the IP-enabled devices that medical providers and people that provide care, those are a different variety of what you could argue as IoT or IP-enabled devices that you can't manage traditionally. And this extends on, right? We can go through transportation, retail, logistics. And the number of logos just really speaks to what I showed in that previous slide. The proliferation of these devices and being able to manage them, onesie twosie, is just not a good approach. There's too many of them to use the strategy that we use with, hey, you got Windows, you got Macs, you got Linux, maybe Android, iOS. It's a whole different proliferation of these devices that are unique by manufacturer, and I'd argue they're unique by vertical as well, or what the actual organization has in place in terms of what it does as a business. So these innumerable devices, OS types, are really posing. That's really where this challenge is kind of the genesis of the challenge. So if we go back and we kind of look at, well, what did we learn when iPhone came out and Android and these devices that users were bringing to the network, and shadow IT, however you want to refer to it, really what it came down to was, users were using these devices. They were going to, ultimately find themselves on the network, and what were the strategies that were used to kind of manage those. Gartner refers to these now in this space as, enterprise management, where you don't just manage your Windows platform, you manage Mac, iOS, Android. We're starting to see things like, Microsoft Intune start to own that market, where they're going to manage all those devices from one dashboard. And a lot of times they're not provisioned by IT, and IT is not going to be able to manage these devices via an agent. So sometimes there's different strategies that need to be used, or they just walk away from managing them altogether and say, hey, this BYOD device is only going to be able to access this part of the network. So there's a lot of different ways that, the challenges, how they were addressed. The next set of challenges, and what we learned there in IoT is, same idea. You're not going to be able to prevent users from bringing in some IP-enabled device, especially if they already have credentials to the guest network or to the wireless network. These devices will find themselves on. If there's anything that we learned from BYOD, it's that users are very persistent, and they're going to find a way to get these devices on here. And the same challenges come in. It's just a different type of device on the network. And I'll give you guys an example. We worked with a company out of Portland, and they had a lot of manufacturing sites down in Mexico. And one of the things that they came out with was, hey, Forescout, can you help us? We ran into this challenge where we found an IP-enabled vending machine that someone down in the manufacturing site brought in. And to them, there was a lot of value in it. They were kind of tired of updating the inventory. They'd go to get their Coke Zero, and it wasn't in the machine. So, hey, this new IP-enabled device was great because the people in the manufacturing facility could, it could automate keeping inventory refreshed and knowing when it needed to be replenished. The challenge to security and network was they had no idea that this device was on the network. They found out about it after the fact. And one of the things that we called attention to was, hey, we're seeing this IP-enabled device on the network and no one really knows where it is. Not only could we isolate where the device was, so they could figure out what it ended up it was that they had around them, but the other thing was from there we were able to extend some of the network controls around that. But backing off that for a second, my point is users and organizations or sub-organizations are going to introduce these in order to help them get their work done. The vending machine being one example. There's going to be a couple others. So a couple of their data points, less than 10% of the devices are going to be manageable in that kind of traditional fashion, Mac OS, use an agent, or even some agentless methodologies that we ourselves use. But the main point here is everything in orange is really blowing up, and it goes back to that proliferation of devices that simply can't be managed with the traditional strategy. IDC is already putting out that 2/3 of organizations have already, as of this year, seen some kind of IoT-related security breach. So the problem isn't going away. A couple of the things that we actually polled customers on was back in 2016. How confident are you that the IoT-specific devices, IP-enabled cameras, printers, VoIP devices, HVAC machines, other things, monitors, how many do you feel that you have a good handle on? And less than 15% said that they did. So obviously those are probably 4 Scout customers, but anyway. So the threat here is 60% new devices are being discovered. These attacks are not going to go away. And I'm going to speak to some of these devices here in particular about what the attacks look like and some specifics around what this actually plays out in the environment, what it looks like. And it can run in everything from something that's going to be disastrous. If you think about a device that covers or powers the AC unit within a data center, if someone were to compromise or take that down, if that data center is managing equipment in a hospital, that could be disastrous. We're talking about life or death situations there where some of those devices are connected to patients, they can't operate correctly. It's at the point of care that those devices can really cause a lot of problems. And then the other is all the way to damaging, disruptive type things where workers aren't as productive, they can't get things done, or potentially intellectual property could be grifted out of the environment. So let's give one of these examples a little bit of color, and that would be an IP-connected or IP-enabled security system or video camera recording system. So a lot of these things have a couple points that lend themselves to being attacked or being compromised. They have a weak proprietary radio frequency that folks can take advantage of because there's no authentication, it lacks encryption. They can send false triggers to this device. They could just jam or spoof it. So if you know that there's a camera there and you can disrupt its ability to actually monitor activity, that's one of the things that could disrupt its use as well. Or a lot of times, and we saw this come up recently with the Mirai attack, is that if we can take advantage of credentials that are either canned or the default credentials are just weak in nature, you can brute force into the device and actually take advantage of it that way. So IP-enabled cameras are becoming much more proliferated and they're proliferating within the environment. That's just one example of some of the attacks that could come into play. And if you're not monitoring what you intended to see with that camera, that could be a point of entry for bad actor. The other would be an IP-connected climate control or energy meter. So HVAC systems, this goes back to my example of some kind of critical infrastructure that's being climate controlled. If someone takes advantage of hacking this system, either getting at it with, again, weak credentials or default credentials, or just being able to get on the device or disrupt its activity, then it can't do its job. This is something else. Great, we've got the productivity of having this device on the network, but certainly we need to take care of how it is hardened in terms of what folks can get at. Another good example, and this came up recently, is a video conference system. So there was actually an example of this that came up within a legal environment where opposing counsel was actually able to get into the other team's IP-enabled war room, and they were recording the strategy that the plaintiff was actually going to come in with. And so the defense attorneys were able to basically get a sneak peek into what the arguments were going to be, and they were prepped to counter for them. And this was uncovered after the fact. But if you take this example and think of, a competitor, being able to sniff into your boardroom and gain access to a smart TV that doesn't have credentials that are hardened or ones that were never changed from the default. They can access the microphone, the camera. They can go ahead and siphon off some very important data, especially as the board's meeting with C-level or marketing or any intellectual property that could be discussed in something like that kind of environment. So going back to the Mirai botnet, this came out in October of 2016. There was roughly 100,000 devices that were involved. It attacked specifically the DIN DNS attack that a lot of the news picked up on. What's scary is since that time, that attack has gone up 17-fold, and it's really come across on a global level. So this actually dovetails into a lot of the things that we see, even from a traditional Windows or Mac type device. The problem isn't that, hey, there's a vulnerability out there and no one knows how to patch it. It's that the time it takes to actually patch it or ever patch it or counter that vulnerability, the delay in doing that or never being able to fully do that because you don't know the devices that are susceptible to that, that just extends even further with IoT. It's really hard, it's really difficult to get into, hey, is this IoT device that I have on my network actually patched, or is it still vulnerable against the Mirai botnet attack? So one thing I'll leave with you with real quick before I bounce over into the console, I'll show you a couple of things within the product itself that kind of extend to some of the things that I've talked to here. We do have some white papers that are out and available on our website that really start to, get a little bit deeper into the discussion around, is my organization vulnerable to this? What is the risk? A couple of good documents there for you guys to take a look at. So with that, I will go here, and I've got I have a demo that I'd like to show you if I can get this to cooperate. Can everyone see my screen? Oh, 1 second.
You can see your screen, but not the new one.
The beauty of a live demo. So I just had this. 1 second. Let me see if I can. I'm just going to pause this for a second, see if I can get the other one to cooperate here. Okay, how's that?
Yep.
So this is Forescout. This is the console. It's pretty much what you'd expect in terms of how you would navigate some kind of GUI that would give you visibility to all the devices on your network. So it's role and scope. I can scope to different parts of the network. If I have a production facility, if I have a guest facility, depending on where these offices are staged on a global level, you can rationalize that through the console and get to these things. All the devices that you see called out here are different devices that have an IP address and find themselves on the network. And really that's where it starts for us to get visibility to a device as it would live and breathe on the network. So if it gets an IP address, it doesn't matter to us if it's Windows, if it's Mac, if it's a guest Windows, if it's a printer, IP-enabled camera, a defibrillator within a medical environment, or some kind of a device that you would find in an operational technology environment. If it has an IP address, that's one of the things that becomes discoverable by our appliance passively in order to see that you have something in the environment itself. So a couple of things I'll show you here. When we look at classifying devices, that's really where things start. It's very typical for us to come in and auto-classify about 90% of the devices on the network. And that lends itself to Windows, Mac, VoIP devices, and starting to get into what we'll refer to as IoT or that kind of operational technology devices that you'd expect to see. Inevitably, we'll usually find a couple devices that we can't classify, but we'll be able to see the attributes coming off of those devices. And that goes beyond an IP address. So the DHCP fingerprint, the ports that are open on the device, that's one of the things that we'll focus on for something like IoT. So an IP-enabled camera will be the example that I'll walk you through. So an IP-enabled camera is going to have a couple of attributes that our engine is going to look for. One of which would be, what is the NIC vendor for this device? A lot of times there's specific NIC vendors that we can use the MAC address off of. I will say this, that is not the only attribute that you want to use. Mass spoofing has been well documented. It is something that you can take advantage of, or that bad actors or even auditors can take advantage of. So that should be one of several attributes that we use for that device. Something else that I would want to take interest in would be open ports. So what are the open ports specific to this IP-enabled camera that I expect to see? And it's as simple as having one stage that we can assess and watermark on that device to say, okay, now I've got the NIC vendor, I expect to see these ports open on it. The other thing that's very common with an IP-enabled camera is a lot of times they draw PoE or power over Ethernet off of the switch. So not only are we finding the IP-enabled device on the network, the other thing that we're discovering is when we reach out to the network itself, and by that I mean the switches, the wireless LAN controllers, we're actually doing a series of show commands behind the scenes where we can see things like, aha, this port is connected to this IP address, which I suspect is an IP-enabled camera. I also am seeing that it's actually drawing PoE off of the switch itself. Not only that, but we can get pretty granular in terms of the power consumption on the device. So for a bad actor, I presented 3 obstacles to you in order to get to this device or even spoof an IoT type device. You need to spoof the NIC vendor, you need to spoof the ports, and now you need to spoof the PoE down to a power consumption level or a range that I expect to see for this device. So that's one example I can show you in terms of how granular our engine gets into when we say, okay, I can't manage this device. It's not Windows, it's not Mac, it's something else, but I'm not going to just rely on one attribute. I'm going to look for several for me to say, hey, this should be an IP-enabled camera. The other thing that we do, and we look at our policy engine that I'm exposing you to, is conditions and actions. The conditions for an IP-enabled camera I just walked you through. It needs to have this NIC vendor, these ports, it needs to draw PoE. That gives me a high level of confidence that I have found this specific IoT type device. From there, the next thing that we can do is reach out to the network and say, this IP-enabled device, this camera in our example, should only ever be talking to certain things within the environment. It should only call home to the DVR server. I should never see this thing talking to users. It certainly should never be reaching into the data center. This thing should only be talking to very specific things that I'm going to control with an access control list or an ACL, or maybe I have an established VLAN that dictates what that device can talk to, an IP-enabled camera or an IP camera VLAN, something like that. The example extends to things like voice over IP as well. If there's a specific voice over IP VLAN, then that is something that once we've identified those devices, that is the only thing that that thing can talk to in the environment. Another example that I'll give you here is when we look at what other things IoT, IoT related challenges that can come up. And one of them that I called out in the example would be, let's go back to the vending machine. The vending machine example was interesting in that, one, no one knew about it. And then two, the other thing that they found was the default credentials on the device were never changed. So they'd introduced this device. Anyone in the world could gain access, if they gained access to it, could just use the default creds that were established. admin and password 123 or whatever the example is. That was a huge vulnerability. So one of the things that we can assess with our engine is actually customize via Telnet or SSH or with SNMP, commonly used credentials. We can not only check for weak credentials, we actually can do a dictionary and look at specific credentials and test the device to see, hey, this IoT related device, does it have weak or default credentials that we need to be aware of? So that's one of the things that our product can do specific to IoT as well, to go ahead and assess just how secure or insecure that device is. So that'd be another action that we could take. Hey, I found this IP-enabled camera. I'm confident that that's what this thing is. Before I actually restrict its access, let's see what it's actually vulnerable to. Does it have weak credentials, or does it have something default that needs to be changed? And I can bring that to folks' attention to fix. So those are just a couple of the examples that ForeScout specifically, when we talk IoT, what we see in the environment. I'm just going to pause there real quick and see if we had any questions. Okay, and it looks like we have one around .1x. How does ForeScout handle .1x or 802.1x for all of our engineer folks around IoT? That's a great question. IoT and 802.1x is a bit of a challenge, and that goes back to what you saw me call out previously within classifying a device. If I just specify the NIC vendor, a lot of times in that layer 2 802.1x world, that's kind of it. I can take that device as NIC and say I can't have an IP-enabled camera participate in the authentication that usually takes place with 802.1x. There isn't a user behind the device. It doesn't have a certificate, or even if it does have a certificate, the authentication for that device is going to be very different than what I would have with a Windows or Mac user. So 802.1x, if we look at the authentication piece, a lot of times what folks have to do is say, take all these IoT devices and put them in what's called a Mac auth bypass, or basically a whitelist that's created to say, I'm going to fixate on the MAC address or the NIC vendor, and I'm going to take these devices. They don't have to participate in the authentication. And so the challenge there becomes you've given a free pass to a lot of those devices, and those are the ones that all those vulnerabilities I just talked about are basically sitting on the network now. They've circumvented the authentication, and you've lost control of that device. The thing that I'd say there is that even without that or having that in the environment, once we find that IoT device on the network, we can go ahead and classify it and interrogate it. And that's where, even if it gets past 802.1x, our solution to that is, hey, you have an IP address, you're fair game on my network. I want to assess what you are based on these attributes and take all those actions, even including up to what I showed you here in terms of what we can do with assessing the device for weak or default creds. Okay, there's another question. Can ForeScout manage IoT devices? Another really good question. So when I think of managing device or most organizations, it goes back to those traditional devices. So Windows, Mac, even iOS and Android type devices, usually there's two things that you can use to manage them. An agent, which is very common, and agents have their shortcomings as well. The more you deploy, the more issues you can run into in terms of having a piece of software that's residing on an endpoint that may not behave the way that it's intended to. The other way to manage those devices is with an agentless methodology. And that's one of the things that ForeScout predominantly relies upon. Yes, we have an agent that we can use to manage Windows, Mac, and check for things like AV and make sure those agents are working, but it's one more agent in play. It's preferred by us, in fact, to use credentials. So the same credentials that your Windows domain administrator is using to assess a device, push policy to it with GPO, make sure that AV is installed running up to date, or an encryption agent, they use a set of privileged credentials to carry that out on a secure basis. We can do the same thing, and usually that's what we prefer. The challenge with IoT is those devices are not traditional in nature. They don't run a standard operating system. you can't have that same ability with those devices to manage them. And that's where we get into what I showed you earlier in the policy. Hey, I found an IP-enabled device, an IoT device. I'm going to get a high level of confidence based on several attributes that tell me that that is what that device is. And then my controls are going to extend to looking for things on the network to quarantine that device off or ensure that it's only talking to the things that it should be talking to. Great question. Okay, so as we wrap up a bit here, I will leave you with this. We've focused our discussion on IoT, but the other thing that I will call out is when I refer to an agentless method, when we find Windows devices on the network, we can manage them with an agentless means by which we're looking for things like assess the device, look and see if antivirus is running. I'll just expose you to the policy here. So it's not just a solution that is specific to IoT. Certainly in the campus, those traditional devices like Windows, Mac, things along those lines, what we can do with those devices is ensure things like make sure that antivirus is up to date and running in the way that I expect to. And if it's not, if the device has antivirus, but for whatever reason, it's not starting, it's not running, that can be an action that we can take automatically to say, hey, found this device, needs to have AV running as part of our corporate posture check and our policy. That is one of the things that is, bread and butter to what Forescout does. And certainly that's available all within the same platform. I think the takeaway here is that we're very much seeing IoT starting to have this huge growth curve and proliferation. We want to extend to customers a way that they can manage those devices with our solution. So, unless there's any other questions, I'll go ahead and flip it back over to you, Tom. And
hey, Chris, I have a question for you.
Yeah,
I have
great.
a question for you. So what level of alerting do you have, and do you have a dashboard that shows at a glance sort of where you think any of the problem devices might be? Sort of
sure.
green,
so,
threat, sort of a risk or threat dash.
Yeah, great question. So we do have a dashboard that we can extend that is going to show exactly devices that are non-compliant. So going back to my AV example, that would be something where in the past X days, 30 days, 7 days at an executive level, here are all the devices that were actually found to not have antivirus running. That'd be something that we can call attention to. The other is that we can actually pipe an alert to something that would be an audit that we could send to something like a SIM type tool. So not only can we show that in our dashboard, but that would be something where we have an audit facility that says, hey, I'm going to go back to my Windows device. We found this device, it wasn't compliant, it had AV, but it wasn't running, and here was the location, the context. I'm going to go ahead and pipe that over to something like a SIM tool like Splunk, ArcSight, QRadar. That's something that we can automate in any time that we find that that difference or that deviation from a posture compliance check. Great question.
And does the system do alerting on any sort of criteria?
Yeah, so if we go back to what I showed you within this policy, and I can get back to this screen. When I have condition in action, I can have that condition be on any number of things. It could be that a device, came into the network. It could be I found a specific, in terms of Windows service that was spun up that I wasn't expecting to see, something that was related to peer-to-peer. So if I find something like a peer-to-peer application that was spun up on a device, I can have my action be an alert that would go ahead and send something like that, very specific, over to via syslog or to we have a couple of extended modules that talk specifically to Splunk, to ArcSight. It could be as granular as you want to be, and you could have that. It could get pretty tricky, right? You could say, it needs to be this specific peer-to-peer app, and the Windows firewall was found not to be running on the device. If those two conditions are met, I want you to generate a alert and Splunk it, send it over to Splunk. So yes, there's a lot of granularity that we can bring to that.
Okay, and then lastly, you do some level of automatic remediation as well, right? Like you can quarantine, or I don't know if you create new policies or not for things that are where they need to be blocked, but you do some level of that, I know.
Yeah, we do. And in fact, a lot of times what we do, we kind of advocate for this, get visibility. Usually when we engage with a customer, we get professional services involved and we go ahead and start the implementation. We usually get them to a visibility state. So for the first 30, 60 days, let's just get a handle on what is running in the environment so that we can uncover things like a vending machine, or in a hospital, what the point of care devices that we expect to see, or maybe some that we didn't. That happens a lot. I'll say this, 20 to 30% of what we find are things that an organization didn't even know that they had. They didn't expect to see them. So it's important to take that first, kind of phase one, just get visibility and audit and get an accounting of what is actually on the network. And then the next part would be something like, okay, for anything that is just, glaringly bad, telnet unencrypted is open on a device in the network. I'm going to do two things with my action. One is I'm going to send a notification to my IT security team. In parallel, I'm also just going to come right at the device and just restrict it. So straight away, I'm not even going to mess around with it. This is something that is clearly not okay. I need to go ahead and take action for it. I'm going to notify the team, and then I'm going to go ahead and just block the device. And that's where we get to, you do want to use an ACL, you want to assign it to a quarantine VLAN. Those are some of the things that we can do. And when we do that in policy, it's done automatically. And there is a precursor to that where you can actually test your policy to see what it would impact if it were running, to make sure that you're not knocking a bunch of stuff off that you don't want to. There's a lot of logic behind it that really helps customers get to that point as part of going beyond visibility.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, it sounds like you're doing everything from giving visibility and real-time monitoring, ongoing real-time monitoring, to ultimately remediation and management, which is exactly what's missing right now.
Yeah, indeed.
All right. So if there's anybody else with any questions, go ahead and type them into the question box. Otherwise, we will sign off here, and thank you very much for attending today, and look forward to following up with you and seeing if we can help you out on your IoT journey. So thanks very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you and talk to you all soon at some event. Thanks very much.